Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Let's just jump right in, because we are embarking on a truly fascinating journey today. We're looking at a story that, honestly, we take for granted way too often. But when you really stop and examine the history, you realize something crazy. None of this was supposed to happen. Today we're exploring the complete 500-year history of America, and we're not looking at it as some inevitable rise to greatness, but as this wild, totally unpredictable, half-millennium journey from an unknown continent to a global powerhouse. Now, what's really interesting to look at here is just how drastic the contrast really is. I mean, think about it. 500 years ago, there was no United States, no New York, no Hollywood, no White House, nothing like that. It was just this sprawling landscape of vast forests and mighty rivers, which was home to thousands of Native American civilizations. But flash forward to today, and that exact same landmass holds the world's largest economy, the absolute strongest military, and literally the most powerful tech companies on Earth. So how in the world did that happen? Well, to answer that, we've got a pretty fast-paced roadmap for today's Explainer. We're going to travel through 5 distinct eras. 1. Before the United States. 2. Birth of a nation. 3. Expansion and division. 4. Rise to superpower. And 5. The modern era. All right, let's kick things off with part 1. Before the United States. So we actually have to start by completely shattering a really common myth. For a long time, the European narrative painted America as this empty, pristine wilderness just waiting around to be discovered. But the reality? It was entirely different. America was already someone's home. Millions of people lived there. We're talking about hundreds of distinct tribes and cultures stretching across North America. And further south, you had these massive, flourishing civilizations like the Aztec, Maya, and Inca, complete with really advanced cities and huge, complex trade networks. It wasn't empty at all. It was a deeply established, thriving continent. But you know, that established world was suddenly turned completely upside down. In 1492, Christopher Columbus accidentally stumbled onto the Caribbean. He was actually looking for a shortcut to Asia and thought he'd hit India. But this total accident basically changed world history overnight. Throughout the 1500s, Spain swooped in and extracted just unimaginable wealth, literal mountains of gold and silver from Central and South America. But here's the crazy part. They looked at the northern lands, didn't see that same instant wealth, and basically ignored them. And that specific decision left the door wide open. So by the 1600s, England decided to try their luck. And before you knew it, 13 tiny, barely surviving British colonies like Jamestown and the Pilgrims had taken root right along the East Coast. Which brings us to part 2, Birth of a Nation. Now, at the time, nobody could have predicted that those 13 struggling colonies would end up challenging the greatest empire on Earth. It was basically a massive chain reaction. Back in the mid-1700s, Britain fought and won this brutal conflict against France for control of North America, with native tribes actually fighting on both sides. But winning that war was incredibly expensive. So to pay off their massive debts, in the 1760s, Britain started heavily taxing the colonies. And that decision? It sparked absolute outrage. A fury that just boiled over until 1776, when those 13 colonies took the massive step of officially declaring their independence. And all of that deep frustration was perfectly captured in one famous response to Parliament: no taxation without representation. It wasn't just some catchy slogan, right? It was a simple, profound demand for a voice. It was literally the explosive catalyst that set the whole road to revolution in motion. But of course, declaring freedom and actually winning it are two very different things. Yet somehow, against all odds, a bunch of ordinary colonial farmers managed to face down the world's absolute strongest military and win. The thing is, the celebration didn't last long, because the young country immediately started falling apart under a really weak first government. They had to pivot, and fast. That struggle is what forced the founders to draft the Constitution, which is, honestly, a totally revolutionary system of government and still one of history's most influential political documents. Once George Washington stepped up as the first president, the great American experiment was officially underway. Moving right along to part 3, Expansion and Division. You see, an experiment confined to just one coast was never going to stay small for long. Take the number $15 million. That's what the United States paid Napoleon for the Louisiana Purchase. That equates to less than 3 cents an acre. It doubled the size of the nation literally overnight. But, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, we have to acknowledge the devastating human consequence of this deal. As settlers flooded west, Native American communities were violently pushed out, losing ancestral lands that their families had called home for countless generations. And the expansion definitely didn't stop there. Following Texas independence and the Mexican-American War, the U.S. swept up another huge block of territory: California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, historically speaking, the United States stretched all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And then, everything just went into absolute overdrive. Gold was discovered in California, and the news spread like wildfire. Within months, hundreds of thousands of people dropped everything to rush west. Cities out there practically exploded in size overnight. Railroads aggressively pushed across the continent to link everything up, and the American economy accelerated at a pace nobody had ever seen before. However, all this explosive growth brought on America's greatest crisis, and it didn't come from an outside enemy. It came from within. In 1861, the nation completely fractured in the American Civil War. The central, unavoidable issue was slavery. You had the North, which wanted to stop it from expanding, and the South, whose entire economy depended on it. In the end, the Union survived and slavery was abolished, but the cost was almost unimaginable. Over 600,000 lives were lost. That's a devastating tragedy that left deep, deep scars across the nation that would linger for generations. And that brings us to part 4, Rise to Superpower. So having survived its own internal collapse, the country started stepping out of isolation and making some highly strategic moves on the global board. They bought Alaska, annexed Hawaii, built the Panama Canal to link the world's oceans, and completely defeated Spain in 1898. With their naval power surging and their industrial base becoming the biggest on the planet, the message was loud and clear. America was no longer just an isolated country across the Atlantic. It was a major global player. And that newly found power was immediately put to the ultimate test during the World Wars. In the 1910s, America entered late but fundamentally tipped the scales in World War I. Then, just a couple of decades later, the absolute shock of the Pearl Harbor attack pulled the nation fully into World War II. During this time, American factories were churning out weapons and supplies at a completely astonishing rate, fueling massive military deployments across both Europe and the Pacific. By the time the dust settled in 1945, America had emerged as a brand new, undisputed global superpower. But history never really takes a break. The moment one enemy disappeared, another one stepped right up to take its place: the Soviet Union. This kicked off a 50-year Cold War. For decades, the globe was gripped by this fierce, constant tension. The US and the Soviets were essentially locked in a massive staring contest, competing across every possible arena: space exploration, advanced technology, traditional military might, and, most terrifyingly, the massive buildup of nuclear weapons. And really, nothing captures the sheer scale of that superpower rivalry quite like what happened in 1969. America successfully landed humans on the moon. This wasn't just some cool scientific milestone. It was a major victory symbolizing absolute, undeniable technological dominance. And this brilliantly illustrates just how wildly far the nation had come. I mean, think about it. From 13 struggling, disconnected colonies to literally walking on the surface of the moon. It's almost unbelievable. Which finally leads us to part 5, the modern era. Eventually, the Soviet Union collapsed, and America found itself standing alone as the world's sole superpower. But the nature of that power started to shift. It wasn't just about pure military might anymore. It became all about technological innovation. Enter Silicon Valley. The internet completely revolutionized how we communicate, and companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon fundamentally reshaped everyday life around the entire globe for almost everyone watching this. Modern dominance became digital. So when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, the story of America is this extraordinary, incredibly complex journey. We're talking about a transformation from an unknown continent to a dominant force, driven by fierce ambition, incredible discovery, brutal conflict, and unparalleled innovation. And whether you admire it or criticize it, the sheer impact of this 500-year improbable rise on our modern world is just totally impossible to ignore. Today, America stands as one of the most powerful and influential nations in human history. But a story of constant, relentless change never actually ends. So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. After more than 500 years of totally unpredictable history, what exactly will the next chapter hold? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today on The Explainer, and I will catch you in the next one.